and particularly thanks to Tim for the invitation to talk about the Lake Champlain's high resolution bathymetric data. I also wanted to acknowledge the unbelievable and continuous support provided by the Lintelak Foundation in making this project a reality. Other financial support was from Vermont Sea Grant. Darren Billard from the Atlantics Corporation was gracious enough to provide the company's IMU post-processing software for free. In itself, this saved many weeks of tedious work. But before we get into the workings of the multi-beam program, it's worthwhile to go back and take a look at the progression of bathymetric data for Lake Champlain. For anyone who's plied the waters of Lake Champlain, you have at one point in time or another run across the typically used NOAA charts based on roughly 9,800 lead line observations taken in the mid to late 1800s. In keeping with the International Hydrographic Office's requirements for nautical charts, shoals or shallow waters that can or could be navigational hazards for vessels are well defined. But in all other regions, details regarding the shape, the structure, and characteristics of the lake bottom are very limiting and sadly left to one's imagination. For a wide variety of reasons, it's not difficult to imagine the need for a major upgrade in the lake's lead line observations. This bathymetric upgrade actually began by sheer accident. When in 1989, my wife Patricia took a geology department faculty position at Middlebury College with a specialty of marine geology and oceanography. As such, she inherited not only a 32-foot lobster boat to conduct classes on, but just as importantly, a side scan sonar unit. The side scan is an acoustic sonar system that rapidly sends and receives back high frequency sound pulses to its left and right as it is pulled behind a surface vessel. It is an excellent system for locating objects that are elevated above the local surrounding background, very similar to you shining a flashlight on the floor of a very dark room to avoid tripping hazards. Bright reflections and shadows provide a vast amount of detailed information on the object being studied, such as this shipwreck. As you can see, Art Cohen, then director of the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, convinced Pat to start several survey programs to locate previously undocumented underwater shipwrecks. These small duration surveys finally evolved into the start of the 1996 whole lake mapping program to locate and characterize a very ambitious every historical artifact on the bottom of the lake. It fulfilled its goal after 7 years, ending in 2002. The mapping pattern used to cover the entire lake and not miss anything is known as full coverage mapping, which is entirely dependent on the swath range of the instrument. At being towed at 10 meters off the bottom, the swath coverage of the sonar fish was 200 meters. That is 100 meters on either side. Employing the well-known pattern of mowing the lawn, parallel ship tracks separated by 185 meters provided a necessary overlap of 15 meters so nothing would be missed. It is important to note, however, that side scan is not a depth mapping system. So how is this program helpful in creating a new bathymetric map? The answer was in the use of the single beam echo sounders, often referred to as fish finders, on each of the 2 research vessels used in the program. The workhorse was the RV Neptune owned by Freddie Fiat. Rather antiquated by today's standard, but it nevertheless got the job done. However, Middlebury College's research vessel Baldwin spent the vast majority of its time in the area between the Crown Point Bridge and Thompson's Point teaching students, hence the increased coverage of depth observations on this map. During the 7-year program, roughly 750,000 observations of depth were acquired. It's critical to understand why I have this aircraft carrier here. So, based on depth information alone, collecting along parallel ship tracks separated by 185 meters, I found that I could put a well-placed aircraft carrier in between those chip track lines so that it basically would never have been detected by the echo sounders themselves. So it's something that's very critical for us to understanding as why we needed to improve the bathymetric map. After nearly 3 years of amalgamating the various lake data sets, post-processing, verification procedures, and numerous surface generation models, the first major upgrade to the bathymetry of the lake was released on September 6, 2005. Along with the visual map, a 10 meter by 10 meter gridded data set was released to the public with caveats. Now, I would be happy to discuss this caveat condition in more detail later if anybody is interested. There was a lot of fanfare when Middlebury College President Ron Leibowitz and Senator Patrick Leahy were on site for its unveiling. So, what were the noticeable improvements fostered by this new bathymetric database? The first was that the company Navionics created improved navigational charts of the lake, which in turn provided enhanced detail for emergency and disaster response teams, boater safety, recreational use, and historic protection. Commercial endeavors were also benefited by the enhanced resolution. One company utilized this data to map out preferred pathways for an underwater power line from Canada to New York City. Improved numerical modeling was capable of providing lake management additional information regarding detailed movement of water masses, emergency response calculations for the movement of undesired contaminants such as an oil spill, improved understanding of harmful algal blooms, and phosphorus control through TMDLs, just to name a few. Even the Canadian numerical modelers and the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab utilized this data in the creation of their larger hydrodynamic modeling. So, were there any reasons why the 2005 data should be updated, even though it provided major improvements to our knowledge of the lake? First, I'm going to go through a list. Depths less than 10 meters were not surveyed. To work around this, the NOAA data, yes, the mid 1800 NOAA data, were used to fill in the remaining shallow water portions of the lake. Much of the data was during a time when GPS was at its infancy, and the term selective availability was something that continually plagued many of the members of the research community. Although not impractical, daily water level variations were used instead of hourly observations for the necessary depth corrections to the standard reference level plane of Lake Champlain. The assumption of the 1500 meter per second standard water velocity was used even though data was post-calibrated to well-known wire-out depths. For sure, it was necessary, but not a perfect solution. Comparing the individual dots on the lake map created by the single beam echo sounders to the unmapped area, it's not hard to believe that only 2% of the entire lake was actually mapped. The remaining 98% was computer generated. And finally, chirp observations that we will be discussing next were continually providing more detailed information on lake floor dynamics than the 2005 data set could provide. So this is the CHIRP system. It stands for compressed high intensity radar pulse. It is a tow behind unit that has increased power, sonar power, that can penetrate into the sedimentary layering and provide unique, and I must admit, impressive views of the lake's substructure. This image shows the typical type of chirp results in Lake Champlain. It's quite easy to pick out the major epochs of the lake's history, from bedrock to glacial debris, which is Lake Vermont, a brackish water environment known as the Champlain Sea, and the present-day Lake Champlain sediments. But there are anomalies in most of these records, like this large block of sediment defined by the arrows that slid down from its higher perch on the shelf and slope boundary and bulldozed itself into the more stable sediments. Similar anomalies like this one in a completely different part of the lake always make their appearance in these records. Here, a smaller, well-defined block of sediment that moved from its higher elevation to one some 15 meters deeper, or one that left an obvious 15-meter high fault scarp behind. All of these providing strong evidence of subaqueous mass wasting events, also known generically as underwater landslides, that were either non-existent or poorly defined in the 2005 data. So welcome to the introduction to multi-beam. Multi-beam is a complex system of components that permit real-time swath mapping of bottom depth. And I want to re-emphasize that depth, not like the side scan, using as many as 2,048 individual sonar beams. Looking at it in a slightly different way, simply replace the word beams with fish finders, and I believe you'll get the idea. The lateral swath range is highly dependent on depth, but can also be controlled by the operator from 70 to 140 degrees, depending on the circumstances. The components of the multi-beam system are the very expensive multi-beam itself, the mounting bracket that must be rigidly attached to the vessel. It is this unit that holds the multi-beam sensors. I will also add that these types of systems cannot wobble or vibrate while the ship is underway, and sometimes it's a very difficult solution to obtain. The next one is the IMU, or inertial motion unit, which monitors GPS, heave, pitch, roll, and yaw up to 30 times per second. The theodolite denotes the requirement that all sensors related to the multi-beam must be mapped to within a resolution of 2 centimeters relative to the inertial motion unit, which is definitely not a fun project. Finally, the all-important sound velocity profiler. Most people believe that a beam of sound propagating through the water will stay on its linear path, and when it reflects off the bottom, it will return along the same path. And if we continue our discussion to a freshwater body, such as Lake Champlain, this is true for water that is isothermal from top to bottom, which in turn implies that sound velocity is also constant from top to bottom. Therefore, every beam would be identified by a mathematical solution to its position and depth exactly where that sound ray encounters the bottom. During non-winter conditions, however, the lake's thermal structure and therefore sound velocity structure changes rapidly with depth. So look at the image on the bottom left, and I'm going to change it rapidly to this. As you can see in this replacement image, the refraction of sound waves can significantly bend the path of the wave rays so that a completely different set of bottom solutions to depth and position are acquired. The determination of sound velocity within the water column is an essential, repeat, essential component of multi-beam mapping. To make sure that the proper sound velocity profile is correct for that specific survey region, profiles are typically taken every 2 hours or less, depending on the type of environment that is being mapped. This could be due to a river input with a different water temperature, shelf water versus deep water domains, heating and cooling of the surface layer, as well as internal dynamics of the lake, such as seiches. As this image shows, over the course of 2 weeks in Seneca Lake, sound velocity changed 21 meters per second at the surface, 23 meters per second due to thermocline variations, and to a much lesser degree of only 3 meters per second in the deep. As you will soon see, variations of as little as 0.1 to 1 meter per second can invalidate the entire bathymetric track line that in turn requires time-intensive modification of the sound velocity profile using the refraction editor. Knowing this information, I believe you can visualize these beams moving over the bottom of the lake in response to the chaotic motion of the vessel itself, i.e. heave, pitch, roll, and yaw. To counteract this chaotic motion of the various beams, data from the IMU is used to mathematically solve for the solution of having the ship as a neutral body, thereby solidifying the path of the beams through time. Similar to side scan, repeated parallel mapping will create a mosaic that is continuously updated and displayed in real time. The David Folger, funded by the National Science Foundation, replaced the RV Baldwin in 2012. This multi-purpose research vessel with nearly $500,000 of equipment, one piece being the multi-beam system, was the only research platform for the survey. As a matter of fact, it was the only research vessel on the lake that had multi-beam. The Folger's 7125 Reson multi-beam utilized 512 individual beams. The CHIRP, as previously discussed, provides information on sediment layering. Inside the Folger's lab, which is a major improvement from Freddie Fayette's RV Neptune lab, the real-time data acquired directly below the ship can be seen on the left monitor. At this point in time, when the photo was taken, Aaron and Art were re-imaging a shipwreck in greater detail by having all the beams confined within a narrower swath angle of roughly 70 degrees. On the monitor to the right, the real-time updated mosaic of the lake floor can be seen. On October 4th, 2023, not so long ago, the multi-beam survey was completed for Lake Champlain after 11 years. But it's important for me to clarify what the word complete really means. For the safety of the crew, equipment, and vessel, not to mention significant time commitments, depths of less than 10 meters were not obtained, as can be seen in the amount of white and light blue regions remaining in the NOAA coverage maps. The criteria was waived, however, when it was deemed important for specific research, such as conducted in Missisquoi Bay with an average depth of 4 meters, or in highly traveled and narrow pathways, such as from the Canadian-US border to the broader northern portions of the lake, or in shoal regions that were found to be inaccurately located or portrayed on the original NOAA charts. This criteria was defined at the onset of the program based on our belief that Bathy LiDAR would be available within the next decade to fill in these regions. A later inventory of the project showed that roughly 32 billion raw observations were collected. Due to its overall size and capability of the processing software, the lake had to be divided into smaller segments. In the end, 12 segments were created, even though they would be processed with the same criteria. The difference between multi-beam imagery and previous generations of bathymetric maps are quite obvious. In this example, note the NOAA-defined orange-colored circular shoal located in Town Farm Bay. It's denoted as an 11-foot elevation. The multi-beam mapping showed that the actual shoal was found to be both mislocated as well as misshaped. Since multi-beam resolution is inversely related to depth, That is, shallow depths provide greater details since all the beams are confined into a much shorter lateral distance, whereas in deep water, the beams are spread out farther from each other and less detail is obtained. This 15 centimeter per pixel resolution image can easily define the shoal's structural bedding as well as other small scale features such as anchor drags. In deeper water and directly east of the Boquete River, the comparison between the 2005 10 meter by 10 meter data and the multi-beam higher resolution data is rather apparent. For example, the orange arrow points to the broad channel that and its greater structural detail. You can also see the well-defined fault scarp on its northern boundary, indicating past historical landslide activity. The structural detail of a deeper bathymetric rise, defined by the black arrow, is clearly superior when compared to the smoother, fuzzy-looking feature in the 10 by 10 image. The red arrow shows the presence of several river outfall channels, most likely created during intense spring runoff of the Boquete River with very cold and sediment-laden water. Looking closely, one can see the ladder-like structures in these channels, which are most likely sediment waves that are migrating, believe it or not, up channel under these high-speed downflow regimes. Remember this image from the chirp data and the fact that the 2005 data wasn't sufficient to accurately define this feature? Finally, it was mapped out as a massive landslide using a combination of multi-beam and chirp data. This large landslide was calculated to have a volume of roughly 10 million cubic meters. Its origin was a large block of sediment dislodged from the shelf and slope region just south of Burlington. What you are seeing is its associated debris fan on the bottom of the lake. Also notice the amount of structural detail found within the debris fan itself, which can be used to help define the physics of its motion. The Great Pyramid and Pentagon are shown as comparative references of 2.6 and 13.4 million cubic meters respectively. I actually wanted to take the Pentagon and scale it appropriately and stuff it into the debris fan, but I ran out of time, so I'm sorry about that. Next time. Landslide complexity is common within Lake Champlain, and while it can be very difficult to unravel the episodic timing of some events, some are quite simple. One such example set of multiple landslides that have very straightforward temporal relations to each other are shown by the timing markers T1, T2, T3, and T4 as they form a layer cake of superposition stratigraphy. The next few slides will discuss the various steps that must be taken in multi-beam processing using the CARE software package. The first and easiest step, although time-wise intensive, was the post-processing of the IMU and positional data via the recalculation of satellite ephemera. This shifted the initial horizontal and vertical accuracies of 1 meter to that of 1.7 and 4.2 centimeters respectively, a huge change to say the least. The second step was the creation of verified sound velocity profiles within yearly folders through the process of restructuring the original profile data, verifying its time and location with logbook information, and finally, ensuring that each profile possessed a smooth and continuously increasing sound velocity profile from top to bottom. The third step was that of collecting and processing all high frequency water level data, which would be 5 to 15 minute sampling rate for the Lake Champlain Basin. This included the Canadian station at Phillipsburg in Missisquoi Bay. Eventually, all these data were all re-referenced to GMT time for basin-wide modeling of lake level for any given location and any time that could be in turn applied to every multi-beam depth observation. Once these three steps were completed, all the multi-beam data within each leg segment had to be recalculated, or in terms of multi-beam processing lingo, georeferenced. In some segments, recalculation could take as long as 1 to 2 days. Processing errors, which often occurred, lengthened the process. The multi-beam system is an amazing tool for high-resolution mapping, as you've previously seen. However, it is also has the uncanny ability to capture a tremendous amount of information within the water column. The worst offenders being fish. As mentioned previously, statistical filtering was designed to remove a majority of these outliers, while at the same time not severe enough to remove entire shipwrecks. However, when fish congregate into large numbers, statistical filtering no longer works and manual editing is required. In this plan view image, there are a number of anomalies that need to be investigated to find out whether they represent true bathymetric features such as large rock slides or not. As it turns out, the 3D editor confirms that these features were massive numbers of fish interfering with the detection of the true lake floor. As you might expect, the removal of these outliers is very time consuming, but is nevertheless a necessary component of the multi-beam processing. Take a look at these two images and see if you notice something that doesn't appear to be natural in both of them, other than the presence or lack of ship tracks for reference. If your answer is yes, then you are right, and you're now looking at the effects of one or more sound velocity profiles that do not perfectly represent the sound velocity structure of the lake in that region and at that time. In other words, the bottom of the lake does not appear to be smooth, but rather banded along the direction of the ship tracks, and is an immediate diagnostic of the application of improper refraction dynamics. If we take a cross-sectional view through a portion of the banded region, shown by the red rectangle, the 3D and 2D editors provide an exceptional view of the problems that refraction errors create. The left side of the image shows the location of the previously defined rectangle superimposed on the bottom bathymetry, even though incorrect. The upper central image provides a three-dimensional view of all the data contained within the rectangle, while the lower panel shows the two-dimensional, very thin cross-sectional view defined by the heavy, dark yellow line at the bottom of the rectangle. It's important to note that the vertical exaggeration is 30 times normal in both panels. This gives me a better chance for proper calibration. A closer look at the image here shows that there are two track lines, believe it or not, that are properly calibrated with sound velocity. Those separate track line swaths, denoted by the two large arrows, show a very smooth transition between them and is required to be the standard for all track lines. Surprisingly, only slight modifications, 0.1 to 1% of the average sound velocity curve, are needed to correct the initial improper alignment to that of a more realistic bathymetric surface. The only unfortunate part of this process, it is a massive time hog, unbelievably massive time hog. For example, in this one instance of recorrecting that one section, it took over 1 hour to make the corrections and install them into the process data. And this is only for one very small portion of the several kilometer long track line that must be adjusted. It's quite possible that for the 8 out of 10 track lines that need to be adjusted, This process will take anywhere from 5 to 10 hours to accomplish. Preservation of historic artifacts is an essential component of the survey. To publicly release the locations of any of these features is a violation of federal and state law. In addition to this requirement, care must be exercised to preserve the highest quality records of these features. During the whole lake side scan mapping program, over 2,000 targets of interest were defined. 386 were previously known, and it is expected that an additional 374 will be documented. Further research will be required to document the remaining 1,300 targets. As earlier noted, multi-beam resolution is inversely related to depth. In shallow water, shipwrecks can be identified extremely well, while in deeper water, a significant sized shipwreck may very well look like a small cigar tube. Unfortunately, the statistical filtering used to remove a large majority of outliers can also remove valid data related to shipwrecks and their immediate resting site, which may show, for example, dislodged cargo. To return this data loss back into the final data set, every target must be reevaluated. An example of this process would be the well-known wreck of the Water Witch that is located slightly south of Diamond Island and is part of Lake Champlain's Underwater Historic Preserve that makes some of these shipwrecks available to the diving community. In this image, the shipwreck is still visible after statistical filtering. By viewing all of the data points that were rejected by the filtering process, shown in gray, a completely different realization of the wreck can be seen. And as in all manual manipulations of the data via the 2D and 3D editors, over 2,000 targets will require a significant amount of processing time. Simply put, all information related to historical shipwrecks or artifacts of one type or another must be removed from the publicly released data set. When considering the time commitment involved to do this, the easiest and most effective methodology is to filter the data set so that the largest features, i.e. the shipwrecks, that need to be protected are effectively removed. After weeks of testing, utilizing different subsets, having a wide variety of wrecks within the data, the easiest and most effective was that of filtering the data to 10 meter by 10 meter grid output, like that created from the whole lake mapping program. These images show the examples of how well a shipwreck can be effectively removed from the data set within a very short period of time. Even though a very simple process, it nevertheless mandates that some time be spent on ensuring all major artifacts are turned into nondescript bathymetric background. Well, the obvious answer to whether or not Bathy LiDAR data should be included in the final release would be a resounding yes, at least in my terms anyways. Obviously, it would be ideal to provide a complete bathymetric map of Lake Champlain rather than a piecemeal approach of only multi-beam data, missing a lot of the shallow water, being released at some point in time, and then a complete map that includes LiDAR at some later point. Tim has mentioned that such data does exist. However, there have been other pressing issues to solve, and LiDAR is firmly residing on the back burner at this point in time, unfortunately. This finally moves us into the realm of when the multi-beam data set will be publicly released. As a general rule of thumb, Middlebury multi-beam multi-beam processing, not Middlebury processing, takes about 2 to 4 times the amount of effort as it did to collect the data. Though more involved data sets may take 5 to 7 times as long. Using a time reference of 44 weeks for the total accumulation of Lake Champlain multi-beam data, a realistic estimate would be somewhere in the range of 2.5 to 3.5 years. Unfortunately, this timeline became invalid when an insidious corruption of the process data was found to exist, like a slow-moving infection. It started about 3 years ago when the college helped my grant purchase a large array of solid-state memory, about 12 terabytes, for the enhanced processing speed needed for the multi-beam data. It was discovered too late in the game that during intensive, long-duration CPU and disk processing jobs, some taking as long as 33 hours, components of the solid-state memory system overheated. And it was during this time the affected solid-state drives somehow incorrectly rewrote very small portions of the data. This began the slow corruption of the process data that was the culmination of the previous 6 years of work. It wasn't until obvious and repeated system errors were continually encountered that it finally showed the extent of this widespread problem. After a detailed analysis by ITS, several thousand errors within approximately 700 files spread out over the entire project and forced the entire project to come to a grinding halt. It was not until a new computer became available in September of last year that it was restarted. Unfortunately, to a lot of people's regret, especially mine, this reset the processing clock to 0 since every component of the project had to be recreated from original data. So we moved from the 2005 data set to the super high resolution bathymetric data of multi-beam and hopefully, the inclusion of LiDAR data. But when that availability of those data sets for the final map will be defined is a little bit on the unknown side. Now, it's important to mention that some of the data, the original data, was not disturbed because it's only touched once by the software program to read the original data, and then the software creates processed data files that mimic the original. So the original data, fortunately for us, was not destroyed. So that in itself, along with the IMU process data, sound velocity data, were sacred. They were not tampered with. But we have to basically start from scratch and re-import everything in order to create the 12 subsections of the lake in order to finalize this project. And those processing steps that I talked about, which involve, the refraction editor, manual editing, and the list goes on and on and on, will definitely take some time. If I could actually state with some degree of marginal confidence when it would be done, my belief would be somewhere within 1 to 1.5 years, provided I get quiet time to work on the data. At that point in time, I'm open up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Tom. At one point, we had almost 90 participants on our call, so I'm sure there's some questions in there from all of our viewers. So right off the bat, again, if you've got a question, feel free to ask it, type it into the chat box, or raise your hand via the hand function in Teams, and we'll field them as they come in. So my colleague, Steve Fugate, who is our terrestrial LiDAR program manager here at VCGI, Tom, has a question. Steve, do you want to just turn on your camera and ask the question directly?
Yep. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Tom. That was great. That was super interesting. There's a lot of talk about how to merge terrestrial with bathymetric elevation models. So I've got a couple questions around that. One is that you mentioned how at shallower depths you have a higher resolution, which makes sense. But when I think about it in terms of a singular product, it seems like that all has to be one resolution. So do you have to downsample to meet that of the lowest depths? And is there a chart that kind of shows the relationship between resolution you get out of the multi-beam sensor at the different depths?
I have done some chart creation as far as what the resolution would be at specific depths. And that first image I showed you of that shoal that you could actually see the bedding on was 10 centimeters to 15 is our limit as far as the um, quality of data at super shallow depths. And again, this is in an area that we're not typically mapping. This was in close to 20 feet of water, and our boundaries are typically 33 feet. So this was an area that was not typical for us. This particular region was again deemed important for various other research programs, specifically those that were being carried on at Middlebury College. Now, as far as the deeper depths, Lake Champlain's are 122 meters, and at those depths, we can confidently create 2-meter by 2-meter pixels of the bottom, which is actually might be able to sneak in maybe 1.75, 1.5, 1.75, but 2.0 by 2.2, 2.0 meter pixels are quite adequate in providing the detail that we all need at that depth. It's also quite adequate for locating and defining shipwrecks on those maps too. Now, the public release data set is going to be somewhere on the order of like that 10 meter by 10 meter, because I can't release any of the higher resolution data, even though I believe it would be absolutely essential at a later time to spend the time to actually remove every shipwreck or target from the high resolution data, blank it out. So I have like 2 separate complete data sets. And at that point in time, then I believe the case would require, if I wanted to get all of the data at its maximum potential out to the public, the Keras software has the ability to vary its grid structure with depth. And I can specify those out according to my chart. So in very shallow water, it could be, like, let's say 20 centimeters. And in the very, very deep water, it would be like 2 meters. And there'd be a wide range of, various depth ranges that you get different resolution. Did that answer your question?
It did. I'm going to drop a follow-up here in the chat, but it's essentially the goal would be to, or the way I envision it, would be nice as the elevation manager to have seamless statewide terrain bathymetric, topobathymetric, all in one product. But that seems like that's maybe a little far out.
Well, it's like the maps that I create right now to work on the data sets are always 2 meter by 2 meter. And they are of a specific brand. I'm not quite sure if you've heard of it, but it's called the Cube Surface. It's combined uncertainty bathymetric estimator. And because it was designed at University of New Hampshire, they have a specific multi-beam testing facility there. And because of all these various components that build up the multi-beam system, the IMU, the actual sensors of the multi-beam, sound velocity, you name it, all of these sensors have uncertainties associated with them in accuracy. And when you have to combine all of those uncertainties together in order to gain what the International Hydrographic Office calls the overall uncertainty, which allows the data set to be accredited at one level or another in its hierarchy. Right now, I believe our data set is really top notch, and it will fall in the 1A category if you ever want to look it up. But it's a very messy kind of calculation. But I'd say, if you had a 2 meter by 2 meter or 1 meter by 1 meter or something even finer, it would easily blend in with the bathymetric data set.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I can already see the joy of writing metadata potentially about multi-resolution data set for public release, and somewhere in there saying, sorry, the schools of fish were in the way, we had to redact them. So
yeah, believe me, there are a lot of biologists that saw, they would love to get records of where all these fish are. And unfortunately, I have to, just basically expunge them from the records because they're nothing more than an annoyance.
yeah,
And the multi-beam system does have a capability to record the entire water column from top to bottom, but
yeah.
the massive throughput and data storage is like about 100 times more than just collecting what you saw there.
Yeah. So we have a question in the chat from one of our A&R colleagues, and I believe, Sean, correct me if I'm wrong here, this is hopefully to help our partners there at the Agency of Natural Resources map other water bodies in the state of Vermont, not just Lake Champlain. So Sean asks, for the shallow areas, what would be the platinum, gold, and silver options for a boat and sensor for bathymetry? Or the shallower part of Champlain?
Well, one thing that has to be acknowledged is that in shallow water, weeds are going to be weeds, fauna, it's all this flora aspect is going to completely cause aggravation to the person who's doing mapping there, because most of the time you're not going to be able to see the bottom because of the weeds. So if you're going to do any shallow water mapping, it would be best done at time periods directly as available as soon as ice is out and growth has not started. Those are the ultimate times, especially for bathy lidar. If I've seen some bathy lidar that were taken in the middle of summer in shallow regions, and they're virtually non-usable, unfortunately, because they're just all over the place because of the weeds that sometimes actually reach to the surface, like water chestnut. So in that particular case, there are some really good single beam sonar systems that are out that have really advanced GPS and data logging facilities, but you have to spend a lot of time doing that because of the single beam nature. But in many cases, that is sufficient for certain cases. The multi-beam system, believe it or not, has been ported to a wide variety of platforms. For example, I've seen reports of people who have put an entire multi-beam system, that includes all the components, the IMU, the GPS system, they have a sound velocity profiler, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, data recording facility on the back of a jet ski, a large jet ski. And so you can really make some headway with that. I've also seen them put on autonomous surface vehicles, and you can rent those right now. If you're interested, I'll give you the name of a company that will rent them. They're not cheap, but you can actually control them from the shoreline. You will actually give them a controlled survey set of lines, and they will just go off do their thing, and they will radio telemetry their information back to you while you sit in your lounge chair. I've always believed that it would be a lot better to have some kind of escort boat to make sure other boats don't interfere with it, but those things are definitely available. And if you could do that, multi-beam again is going to map larger swaths of the lake rather than a single beam in a day of the week. So right now we're looking at a survey in Cayuga Lake that may be able to use, that would most definitely be able to use these surface vessels. And there are also autonomous underwater vessels, the huge torpedoes that sometimes you'll see that are also equipped with multi-beam. But again, the increase in cost is pretty intense.
Thanks, Tom. Our GIS colleague at Agency of Natural Resources, Eric Engstrom, asks, with a disguised face via emoji, when will VCGI have the bathymetry slope layer available on the geodata portal as public access? And Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, it will be as soon as you go through that redaction process, with fingers crossed that the hard drives don't burn up in so doing.
Yes. When the bathymetric data, the public release, the initial one at 10 meters by 10 meters, anybody can produce any kind of product they want. So if they're looking at slope dynamics or anything like that, that's an easy thing. So
yeah. So when we have derived products, we're all waiting on the public
original
release of the
product.
data, and then we'll see what we can do from that.
Oh yeah, it's a very simple calculation. On my software, I can just punch a few buttons and boom, out it comes. So
yeah. Great. Any questions? I did see, or at least earlier, we had some folks from Vermont Geological Survey, as well from our state archaeologist was on the call. Any questions from those folks? If you're still here, that is.
That's a long time to be away from your desk, that's for sure.
Yes, indeed. Might have dropped out. Great. Well, any questions or comments from any other folks? Steve has one more, my colleague Steve at VCGI. Does the multi-beam sensor allow for similar processes to help identify and remove shipwrecks?
To identify and help remove shipwrecks. Yes and no. It depends on how close the multi-beam sensors are to the shipwreck. Just to repeat, if the shipwreck is very, very deep in the water, like over 100 meters, anywhere, resolution becomes a little bit less. Now you can, take those 140 degrees of swath mapping and just neck it down to like, something small like 70, maybe you could get down to 50 or 60 degrees with some of the new systems and focus all those beams on a very, very small area, in which case you could get some more detail out of that area, but it's going to take you a long time to map. So things like, is there a moat around the vessel? Many, many vessels in Lake Champlain and Cuyahoga Lake and Seneca Lake have moats around them due to high-speed currents. And so that could aid in the program as far as where you have to spend more time or less time evacuating sediment in order to get underneath the vessel with, something like cargo straps or lifting belts or something like that. So it could help. The multi-beam data, at again, higher resolution, could provide information on other objects that are outside of the realm of the vessel itself, such as cargo loads. There have been many cases where the ship has gone down in distress and it dumped a huge amount of its cargo as it went down. And so that cargo is actually spread over, like 100, 200 meters before it actually hit the bottom of the lake. So there are a lot of things that multi-beam can do, but just as importantly, having a side scan unit that is always positioned 10 meters off the bottom of the lake, or at least high enough to not impact the vessel, can also give you immense detail, almost to the point where you could actually count the planks on the deck. It's that the new multi-beams are amazing. So, a combination of both is essentially really very, very good. And, the other thing when it comes to pulling up a ship would be to understand its sediment structure that it's laying on. So the chirp imagery that you saw earlier is an invaluable tool that gives you a sense of how dense that sediment is and what kind of structure it's setting on, whether it be, rocks or you have, a thin coating of, let's say, 2 feet of sediment over bedrock is a huge difference than, you got 30, 40 meters of soft sediment. So all three are really extremely important to utilize when you're thinking about pulling up some kind of shipwreck from the bottom of the lake.
Well, in closing here, I will say we've had several comments of whether you can confirm or disconfirm whether or not CHAMP exists. So we'll have to keep that in mind for the ultimate press release of how we can get
Yeah,
enough eyeballs
yeah.
with the release of this data that we either can or cannot confirm the existence of CHAMP. But Tom, I want to say thanks again on behalf of ECGI and the state's Enterprise GIS Consortium. We're all very excited for the ultimate future release. We understand the detailed work that has to go into getting it ready for such a thing, but take your time, do it right, and we'll be here and ready to help present this as a public information resource once the time comes.
Yeah.
So
And
with
one
that,
thing I could add, to that
Mhm.
is that I'm resurrecting the entire project from the South Lake up. So I have one segment of the South Lake pretty much, not the South Lake, but the South Main Lake above Crown Point Bridge, pretty much I'm satisfied with. I have a few more little tidbits I have to take care of, but it's at least 1 out of 12. But if we wanted to experiment of putting Bathy LiDAR data into that segment of the lake to see how it interfaces, that would be great. That would start the ball rolling as far as the interface procedures to make it work.
Cool. You're welcome to follow up with either myself or my colleague Steve Fugate. I'll put us in touch with on that topic.
Great.
Great. Okay. Well, everyone, thank you again for your time and attention for visiting us, and hopefully we'll see you next week with our ensuing GeoEnlightenment. Take care. Have a good rest of your day.
Okay, you too. Bye.